Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is the third webinar in our winter webinar series for the Citizen Lake Monitoring Network, so welcome. We do record all of these webinars, so you'll be able to find them at the Extension Lakes YouTube channel. I usually get the recording sent out via email within a day or two of the webinar, so you'll probably see it tonight or tomorrow. We do have a playlist there as well, so you'll be able to find any other webinars that have been run in this current series or last year's, or last spring's rather, webinar series. So they're all there for you. Today, please use the chat function to ask any questions of Susan. She has asked to have the questions come in during the presentation, so I will take the questions from the chat and present them to Susan during her presentation. And if we have time at the end, we can ask more questions at the end. So during the webinar today, please keep yourself muted and keep your webcams turned off. That just makes it easier for us, makes the webinar run more smoothly that way, to have less bandwidth being used up by video feeds. Next month, January 27th, we have another webinar coming up, the Groundwater and Wisconsin's Lakes webinar with Paul McGinley from UW-Stevens Point. So join us again for that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Susan. Susan Knight is a research scientist and aquatic botanist at the Trout Lake Station in Boulder Junction. Officially works for UW-Madison, works very closely with DNR and Extension Lakes and many of us here in the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership. Susan and I and Michelle Nault tend to lead the aquatic plant identification trainings in the summertime, so you may know us from there. And Susan typically leads the intro piece there. So I believe, Susan, your PhD was on bladderworts, which is a group of plants that are common in bogs and fens, which Susan will be talking about today. So you'll get to hear all about bladderworts and other cool plants that are in these types of habitats. So I'll turn it over to you, Susan. I'll stop sharing and you can pull up your slides.
Okay. Let's see. How are we doing? Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining me. I'm gonna just say hello and then I'm gonna turn off my video. I just wanted to say a quick hello to a couple people I saw online. Oh, now I realize I have to stop. Oh, there we go. I can stop my video there. Okay. A quick hello to Raleigh Alger. I saw him on, and Ken Hazel, whom I haven't actually met, but understand he's the proud new owner of a bog. So welcome to you both, and to everybody else who came today. So we're going to take a trip to the bog, kind of a dreary December day. It'll be nice to see some color and remember what it's like to be out on a bog in the summertime. So we'll get, let's see if I can get, oops. Just need to figure out how to operate this. Okay, so I'm going to talk about bogs today, obviously. So I'm going to cover the following topics. So what is a bog? Where do we find them? How do they form? And I'm going to have to fudge on that one a little bit. What plants are found there? And why are there so many carnivorous plants there? And what about bog people? And what do bogs and climate change have in common? So let's get right to it. So bogs are really a kind of a peatland, and peat is an accumulation of dead, incompletely decomposed organic matter. And they tend to accumulate and have a whole lot of carbon in them. They're usually waterlogged. They're anoxic, meaning there's almost no oxygen down in those sediments. They tend to be cold just because they're low and sort of that cold air drainage. They're almost, the ones around here are quite acidic, and they're universally low in nutrients. They tend to be in our northern latitudes. So in the northern hemisphere, they're all across northern US, Canada, and then over across Greenland to Scandinavia and Russia, etc. They are replete with shrubs that are in the blueberry family. Those, we call them ericaceous shrubs. and they are loaded with carnivorous plants. So a little bit of a clarification to start with. Our bogs are actually poor fens, and true bogs get their water from precipitation. And that is not true of the bogs, or what we call bogs, around here. We do have some real bogs over in Minnesota, some blanket bogs, but the bogs around here get at least some of their water from precipitation. And so there are rich fens and there are poor fens. And again, the fens get at least some of their water from groundwater. The rich fens tend to have a higher pH, and they're usually rich in some nutrients, maybe not all, but at least a couple. Poor fens, like what we have up here in the North Woods, almost always have a very low pH, 4.5 to 5 or so. They're poor in nutrients, and they have minimal buffering capacity, so almost no alkalinity. And our bogs are actually poor fens dominated by sphagnum moss, shrubs related to blueberries, sedges, and carnivorous plants. So where are the bogs? Well, here is a map of, this is Vilas County right in the center. Off to the west, we have Iron County. To the south, we have Oneida County. And to the east, we have Forest County. So everybody probably knows that this part of the world is loaded with lakes. And so the lakes, where did the lakes come from? Well, they came from ice left by the glaciers, which created kettle holes as the glaciers receded. And I always thought that was a funny term, that the glaciers receded. It's like they, took their snow and left and went home. That isn't really what happened, of course. What happened was that they were melting from the south end toward the north end. And so if you had a time-lapse photography, it would look like they were moving backwards, but of course they were simply melting more on the south end and slowly over time melted to the north. And they left behind all these little chunks of ice, or big chunks of ice, and those created lakes. And some of those lakes started to fill in and became what we call bogs today. And if you look at a topographic map, it's usually pretty easy to see where the bog might be. So this is a close-up of a map from the Crystal Lake area over in Sainer, Wisconsin, just east of Trout Lake. And so you can see Crystal Lake here. And there are a couple of, you can see this little marsh symbol or wetland symbol. And in this one, you can see that there's a little bit of water in the middle. So this is a very typical bog. You've got wetland all the way around, and you've got a little bog pond right in the middle. Here's another one over here. Here's some wetland over here. Almost certainly it is a peatland, but it doesn't have a bog pond in the middle. Doesn't really matter. It's probably going to have pretty much the same vegetation. And you can pretty much imagine that this used to be one larger lake, and it has slowly filled in with bog material. So this is the distribution. The green is where you've got peatlands all around the world. You can see that there are some in the southern hemisphere and even in the sort of semi-tropical areas, but they're mostly in the northern hemisphere and mostly at the highest latitudes. So the dark green is where a high of the landmass is in peatland, and the lighter green is where a smaller percentage of the land is in peatland. So how do bogs form? So sphagnum moss is really the key to moss formation. And sphagnum makes bogs acidic and kind of spongy and to hold water. So the soils where the old dead sphagnum anyway makes for a very waterlogged and no oxygen sediment. So the dead plants don't decompose. There's not enough oxygen and it's too acidic for much decomposition. And so the dead plant material just starts to accumulate. And if you had one of those wetlands with a little lake in the middle, there will be plants around the edge, and those plants will live and die, or especially their leaves will live and die, and they'll fall into the little pond, and they won't really decompose because it's too cold, too acidic, and no oxygen, and the pond will slowly fill up. And likewise, the mat itself will be full of sphagnum, and of all other plants. And then the sphagnum will die and more sphagnum will grow on top, and it'll push that dead stuff down further and further, and it'll sort of compress and go, but it won't really decompose. And so it'll be on its way to being turned into peat. So here is a kind of a diagram that I stole off the internet, and quite clearly it was made for not such being blown up to such a degree, but I think you get the idea. So the top diagram shows you kind of a lake with a little bit of vegetation on the edge. And what happens is you start getting some of this sphagnum growing. It is very spongy and wet and cold, and it's making things more and more acidic. And it's allowing some vegetation to kind of move out and form a floating mat over this lake. And so you've still got the lake underneath, but you've got this kind of a shelf of vegetation overlying the lake. And this process whereby the sediments, or not sediments, but plant vegetation is starting to encroach on the water is called terrestrialization. And eventually you give it enough time and the whole thing will be covered up with vegetation, but you'll still have this orangey stuff. This is the peat. The peat will probably still be remaining. So that's kind of how bogs form. And I said I was going to fudge this because it's not completely clear to me exactly why some lakes turn into bogs and some stay as lakes. They're all about the same age. The glaciers left here about 10,000 years ago. So some of our bogs have been started forming probably right away, some of them more recently. But at any rate, some of our lakes turned into bogs and peatlands, and some of them didn't. So one of the cool things about a bog is that the bog mat does grow out over the water. And so on the very edge, you've got you've got vegetation and it looks like it's firm, but you bounce up and down and it's kind of bouncy. So the plants, again, they will grow and die, but they hardly decompose. And so the dead material accumulates at the bottom of the lake. And the closer you are to the upland, the firmer the mat. But on the lake edge, there's very little material has yet to accumulate. So it's not very firm and it's like a waterbed. So this is my friend, many of you might know her, Carol Warden, and she's going to demonstrate. So we'll see. And I'm not sure you can hear her, but it makes a really cool noise. Bogs. I don't know if you can see the leather leaf out here bouncing around as Carol destroys this bog. Okay. So what plants do we find in bogs? They've got these weird characteristics. The bogs are, remember, very acidic, cold, and very low in nutrients. And it means that there is quite a bit of vegetation out there, but it's quite specialized. Most of the plants that you find in bogs do not grow very well elsewhere, and plants that you would find elsewhere don't grow well in bogs. So it's kind of a unique vegetation that we find there. So the real star of the story is sphagnum moss, and it is a moss, so that means it doesn't have any vascular tissue, so it can't get very big. It doesn't have any tissues that can carry water up or down. And because of that, it's usually pretty short, but it does absorb a lot of water just by capillary action. And sphagnum can absorb 25 to 100 times its weight in water. And it's very soft and quite pretty. It often, out in the sunny parts of the bog, it tends to be red, which is probably has some photoprotection chemicals in it. And it's usually greener where it's a little bit more in the shade of maybe a shrub or a tree or something like that. And if you pull up a clump of sphagnum, like I have here in this lower picture, it's wet, obviously, but you don't know how wet it is until you give it a good squeeze, and then a whole mess of water just comes pouring out of it. It is amazing how much water sphagnum can hold. So the other thing about sphagnum is that it sucks up nutrients and releases acid. So what it's doing is it's like a little cation exchange column. So it's sucking up whatever cations are in the environment there. And cations are positively charged ions like calcium and potassium and sodium, all those things that are in magnesium, all those elements that are way over on the left-hand side of your periodic table that have a +1 or a +2 charge. And you know how chemistry goes, where you have, there's always has to be a balance of chemical elements or chemical charges. So in order to offset the cations that are coming into the sphagnum that it's kind of stealing from the bog, it spits out hydrogen ions, which are also positively charged. So it exchanges calcium, potassium, magnesium for hydrogen ions, and hydrogen ions is what makes something acidic. So your pH scale is a measure of how many hydrogen ions are in your environment. So the sphagnum makes for a very acidic environment, and sphagnum really likes that acidic environment. And so it's going to make itself a very favorable environment, and it's going to preclude a lot of things won't be able to grow there. It also makes it very resistant to decay because it's so acidic. And so it leads to the formation of peat. Another thing about sphagnum is if you touched it up to your face or with your fingers, it's very, very soft. Like I said, it doesn't have any lignin, or it's not woody at all. And so it's very soft, and it was used, they dry it out and use it as wound dressing in World War I. Not a very pleasant thing to think about, but it does absorb fluids. And so you could imagine if somebody had a wound like that was bleeding, it would be useful to use to absorb blood. And it's also antiseptic because it doesn't have many bacteria in it. And so it worked well as a wound dressing. And supposedly it was also used as diapers material for Native Americans. You can imagine how that would work pretty well because it absorbs a huge amount of water. So sphagnum is really the story here. But there are a bunch of other plants, and almost all of these other plants that I'm going to talk about, at least the first few, are in the blueberry family. And the first one I'm going to talk about is leatherleaf. And leatherleaf is found all over the bog, but it is especially common right on the tippy edge of the bog. You can see it growing here. You can see the water in the background. So this is taken from that same bog where Carol was bouncing around. And a couple of things about leatherleaf. First of all, the leaves are leathery. It has a good name. The leaves are almost always held almost erect. So I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it's quite characteristic. The leaves are almost quite vertical. The plant, the stems grow out horizontally over the water and then sort of make a right angle turn and turn upright. And the leaves tend to be, they're green and they're evergreen, but they turn red in the winter and then they'll turn back green in the summertime. But I don't think they live all that long. They're evergreen, meaning the whole plant is always green to some extent, but the leaves themselves probably only live a season or two. The other thing is that they have really pretty flowers. You can see that display up there on the top. They're always held horizontally there. It looks an awful lot like somebody hung out their bloomers to dry on a clothesline. But you have to get out early to the bog to see them. They're going to flower first thing. They're probably the first to flower in the bog, and you may see them as early as sort of middle to late May. A really cool plant, one of my favorites. But this is my favorite. This is bog laurel, Kalmia polifolia. This is another plant in the blueberry family, and it has these beautiful flowers. And the leaves are kind of cool too. So they're very shiny and green, and you might notice that they are held opposite to each other. So you've got two of them alternating at 90 degrees from each other, or I guess there's, 90 degrees from each other going up the stem. And they're kind of enrolled a little bit, and they're a little bit fuzzy, which is characteristic of a couple of these plants. But the really cool thing about bog laurel are the flowers. So these flowers clearly are a gorgeous color of pink, and they're about the size of a dime. And if you haven't ever seen them, you have got to go to the bog early June is when you're likely to see them. Now, you might notice that they have all these little, I'm not sure you can see my, my pointer, but up here on the flower, there are stamens, and the stamen is the male part of the flower, and the filament here is just like a thread, but tucked into the corners of the little recesses of the flower petal are the anthers, which hold the pollen. And so these little stamens are on under pressure or under stress a little bit, and they're almost spring loaded. And so you can imagine if a bee comes along and it crawls around on this flower to get some nectar, the little stamens will boing and spread pollen all over the bee as the stamens get loosened from their little crevices and go springing pollen all over the bee. And this part in the center of the flower is the pistil, and up at the tippy end of the pistil is the stigma. And that's where maybe some pollen will land and will fertilize the flower. So hopefully the plant is hoping that a bee will come along, it'll get doused with pollen and fly on to another flower where it will deposit some of that pollen and the flower will get pollinated. And so if you see these flowers in the bog, you can take a little blade of grass or a little blade of sedge and kind of tickle these stamens. And if they're ready to go, if they're ripe, they will just spring and you'll get a little puff of pollen. It's quite fun to do. You don't want to do too many because you want them to get pollinated, but it is kind of a fun activity. The next plant we have here is bog rosemary. It looks a lot like a bog laurel, at least the plant does, but these leaves are alternate and they're even more enrolled. So they are a lot narrower looking. And like I said, they have alternately held leaves, and the way, because they're not always flowering, the flowers are clearly quite different, but if they're not flowering, it can be a little hard to tell them apart. So what I do is I always look to see, are they held alternately or oppositely? And for me, the way I remember it is, because I'm old, is that I remember Laurel and Hardy. Laurel and Hardy were a couple of comedians, and one was tall and skinny and one was short and fat. And so they were opposites. And so Laurel that we saw before, see, the leaves are opposite, and bog rosemary, they are held alternately. Also, bog rosemary's name is Andromeda, which begins with an A, and that's like alternate. So that's how I remember it. And anyway, the leaves are highly enrolled, and they're also a little bit fuzzy inside, like the Kalmia. And they may look to you like the herb rosemary, and that's probably where its common name came from, but it is not rosemary. It's not the rosemary herb that we use. And in fact, it's quite toxic, so do not eat it. It doesn't have a nice scent anyway. So anyway, I don't think you'd be tempted, but don't go out collecting bog rosemary thinking that you're collecting a nice herb. So, and the flowers are these really pretty white and pink flowers, and again, flowering about the same time as the laurel, in about early to mid-June. Another plant that we see also in the blueberry family, I don't think I said that, but it is Labrador tea, genus just renamed, Rhododendron greenlandicum, and it really has enrolled leaves, and it has really fuzzy undersides. So the undersides of the new leaves are white. This plant I have tipped over so that you're looking at the older leaves down here that are kind of cinnamon brown fuzz, and the new leaves from this year have a white fuzz, and they're very fuzzy, and they're quite enrolled. And they have these really pretty white flowers. The Labrador tea tends to grow a little further back in the bog. It's not as likely to be found out on the tippy edge of the bog. It's going to be found back. I don't know if it's that it likes a little more shade, or it likes it a little bit, the bog mat to be a little bit firmer, but you're not going to see it right out on the tippy edge. So one of the things that I want to say about these plants that I just told you, the the laurel and the bog rosemary and the Labrador tea all have these enrolled leaves, and they're a little bit fuzzy on the underside. Those are all features that you would normally see in dry, droughty conditions, or maybe even in the desert. And you'd think, wow, why would they? I mean, the bog is so wet. It's just the opposite of a desert. And there have been a couple of ideas proposed. I don't know if there's any consensus on an idea, but the best idea that I've heard, and I don't know if this is, in fact, the one that people have kind of decided on, it's not an idea that I came up with, is that in the springtime, the bog mat is still frozen. It's really cold down there. But the shrubs, and these are all shrubs that I've been talking about, these, the laurel and the rosemary and the Labrador tea, they're all shrubs. They are sticking up out of the snow, out of the mat, and they are usually out in the sun, and they're probably really getting a lot of sun, and there's probably a lot of water stress on them because of that sunshine, and yet their roots are still embedded in a frozen mat. So it could be that they're very water stressed in the spring, and maybe that's why they have these adaptations to droughty or dry conditions. Not really sure, but it's very conspicuous and kind of funny. So another plant in the blueberry family is the cranberry, Vaccinium macrocarpum. There's also Vitis idea, so a couple different species. This has a really pretty flower. This flowers a little bit later in the summer, so more like early to mid-July. And it has really tiny little leaves, especially compared to the enormous cranberry. But they're pretty much found just creeping along. They don't really stand up. It is a shrub because it does have woody tissue, but it is not, it's not trying to stand erect. And otherwise, I think the cranberries would just weight it down onto the ground. So the cranberries are good size. You can see that penny there. They're really not much different from the cranberries that are grown in the bogs. So, and the flowers are really pretty. And as the story that I've heard is that these petals of the cranberry flower almost look like a crane with their wings flung back. And then this, the pistil, or the female part of the plant, is sticking out here, kind of like the beak of a crane. And so crane became cranberry, and that's where it got its name, as far as I know. A really, really pretty plant. And some bogs you can go and they're loaded with cranberries, and you can pick your own, about the time that the cranberry bogs are picking them in, usually mid-September or so. Winterberry is another plant that you can see, a really pretty plant. It has tiny little leaves. They kind of look like cranberries, but they're rounder and smaller. And it's usually found just growing kind of sprawled all over sphagnum. It's also in the blueberry family, has a really pretty white blueberry-like flower. And it's fun to see in the bog, and also tends to be in the shadier parts of the bog. So not all blueberry plants in the bog. We also have a bunch of sedges. Sedges, this kind of this grassy looking stuff that you see all over the bog, are almost certainly sedges. There aren't usually all that many grasses in a bog. Sedges are kind of grass-like looking, but it's a completely different plant family. Most of them are in the Carex genus. Like this one, Carex oligosperma, is a typical bog sedge. And so you could see that all over the bog. But there are also a few other sedges like cottongrass. And cottongrass is also a sedge in the sedge family, but it's Areophorum, a different genus, very distinctive. There's no, you can't mistake it. There are a couple of different species, but this one obviously in the wind, and it's really cool. These also tend to grow a little bit further back. They're not going to be right out on the edge of the bog, but you can see these pretty early. So you're going to see these by late June or so, showing their white fringe. There are a couple of trees that you'll find in the bog, larch or tamarack, Larix laricina. And kind of the interesting thing about larch or tamarack, is that it is a conifer, meaning it has cones like pines and spruce and balsams and all those kind of plants, but it is deciduous, so it loses its needles every year. So these needles you see are the beautiful soft green needles that you see first thing in the spring, very, very soft and pretty, and they turn a spectacular golden color in the late fall. So usually after all the other maples and oaks and all those and the popples have turned color, you'll see the tamaracks turning this beautiful golden hue. We also have black spruce that are found in the bog, and they are just your normal everyday conifer that is not deciduous. And so these are evergreen, and you would see them green all year long. All right, let's talk about carnivorous plants because they are probably the coolest thing about bogs. And so why are there carnivorous plants in bogs? Well, the biggest reason is because it is so nutrient poor, and carnivorous plants are plants that will capture animals, mostly insects, in order to augment their nutrients. So they will have roots, but the roots don't do them much good because there aren't any nutrients to speak of in the bog. There aren't, what they really need is nitrogen and phosphorus, and there just aren't many in the bog because, going back to what I said about peat, peat is partially decomposed plant material, but it does not decompose to the point where the nutrients are given up, like you might see in an upland. Those leaves and stuff that fall, they get decomposed, and those nutrients in those leaves get recycled, and the trees can take them up again. But that is not going on in the bog. There are just no nutrients to be had. And so the bogs have to go out and capture their own. So this first one is a pitcher plant. Hopefully you've all seen a pitcher plant. They're pretty cool looking plants. The pitcher itself is a leaf, is the leaf of the plant. And you can almost imagine a big leaf, maybe like a lily, like a pond lily or something like that, that's been folded up, and it actually is waterproof enough so that it can capture water. It captures rainwater, and it's semi-filled with water. And again, I'm not sure you can see my cursor, but up here on the on the pitcher, there are all these little hairs, and the little hairs are pointing downward into the bog, into the pitcher. And so insects are attracted to this lovely decorative pattern on the pitcher. I don't know if they think it's dead meat or what they think it is, but they're attracted to this. And often there's a little bit of nectar along the rim of the pitcher. And so insects are attracted here. And if they're walking along the inside of this pitcher hood, they'll be directed down, down, down. And eventually the wall of the pitcher gets so steep that the insect or whatever it is will just fall into the little pool of water, and it won't be able to escape, and it'll drown and it'll die. And there'll be all this decomposition going on just from natural bacteria that came in with the insect. And the nutrients from that insect, like nitrogen and phosphorus, will be absorbed by the pitcher itself and transferred to the plant. And that is how the pitcher will get a lot of its nutrients. And so it might seem hit or miss that you'd get an insect that would actually land here, but they do, and that's how they work. So one of the cool things about pitcher plants is that they have these really cool looking flowers, which are dangling on this big hook-shaped stem. And so anytime you're out in a bog, be sure to check out the pitcher plant flower, because it's really unusual and very cool looking. And it's on these giant tall stalks. So why do you think the pitcher plant flower is so tall? This is not a joke, actually. So I'm just going to give you 5 seconds to think about why the pitcher plant flower might be so tall. Okay, all right. So, whoops, your time is up. And so the answer is, and I'll bet a lot of you thought of it yourself, is that the pitcher plant is interested in insects, but in two different groups of insects. It wants some insects to eat, to capture. And so those are going to be down on the ground where the pitcher plant, where the pitcher is. But it also wants to get pollinated because it needs to get pollinated by insects that are going to fly from flower to flower to flower. And it doesn't want those insects to get sidetracked and get caught down in the pitcher. So it's attracting who knows what, probably bees to pollinate the flowers, and other insects, probably flies of some sort, to capture in their pitchers. So 2 different groups of insects. And I should add that pitcher plants and other carnivorous plants are capturing animals in order to augment their nutrients, but they're still photosynthetic. They're not relying on the insects for their carbon. So they're still photosynthesizing. They're capturing CO2 and photosynthesizing to make sugars and all that. But the insects are helping with their nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Even though they're not super green, they are photosynthesizing. So a really fun thing to do when you go to a bog is to see what they just had for lunch. So when I go to a bog, I always bring some Petri dishes and some fat pipettes, and I'll suck out the contents of a pitcher, put it in the Petri dish, and look around and look to see what I can see, what they have eaten. And so here we have a little video of what you might see. So yeah, so it's kind of interesting that the pitchers are full of mosquito larvae. And like I was talking to Carol, they evidently, I've been told, they are not the kind of mosquitoes that bite people. So I don't know what they do when they're mature, if they need a blood meal or not, maybe they don't. But at any rate, they're living off of whatever soup is created by dead insects down in the pitcher. And these are probably, dregs of insects gone by. But anyway, pitcher plants are really cool. Fun to do little experiments with them. So our next carnivorous plant that I want to talk about are sundews. And sundews are another carnivorous plant, also capturing insects in order to augment their nutrients. And the cool thing about these are less passive than the pitcher plants. So anyway, they are. I think I'm getting a request to stop sharing. Am I, Paul?
You shouldn't be.
Okay.
Go ahead and share again.
Okay, sorry. There we go. All right, I saw that. Anyway, so the sundew are not as passive as the pitcher plant, but they. So what they do is they have these bristles. Well, you can see the leaf is shaped kind of like a little spoon. Not all the sundews are as spoon shaped. There are some that have a little bit narrower leaf, but this particular one is rotundifolia, so it's got a round leaf. And all these little bristles have a tiny little drop of what looks like dew at the tippy end, which is probably where its name comes from, but it isn't water at all. And it's actually very, very sticky. And so if an insect lands thinking that it's going to get a little sip of water or maybe just a nice place to land for a moment or two, it's going to try and take off, and it's going to be stuck there because its legs are going to be ensnared in this sticky molasses-like stuff. And the bristles will actually, once the plant perceives that the insect is trying to is wiggling and generating some turbulence on that little leaf, all those bristles are going to start moving and just start surrounding that insect. And so pretty quickly, within just a few seconds, the insect will be enclosed. The bristles will have enclosed around that insect like they did around this one right here. And then over the next few minutes, the whole little spoon will curl up and completely encase the insect. And so, and I understand, I've read that the sundew actually does exude enzymes to dissolve the insect. So it dies and it's actually dissolved. I don't think that's true in the pitcher plant. So, and then the little spoon of the sundew will unfurl and those bristles will go back to work and can capture more insects. So they're very cool. These tend to be on the tippy edge of the bog. They're quite small, so you have to look kind of hard for them. I don't have a picture of it, but they also have flowers that are held quite a bit above the sundew leaves, probably for the same reason that the pitcher plant flowers are held way above. So the last carnivorous plant I'm going to talk about are bladderworts, which are my favorite. And the bladderworts in the bog are not really found on, they are not found on the mat itself, but they're found in the pond if you are lucky enough to be on a bog that has a little bog pond at the center. So this is what a bladderwort looks like down here in the bottom left. And they're usually green, so you can see that they are photosynthesizing. And their traps are not capturing insects, or at least not flying insects. They're capturing almost exclusively zooplankton, especially in the water. So they're capturing things that are really small. They're probably not quite microscopic, but they're pretty small. And the way these work is, you can see in the top left, you can see an individual bladder. And this particular bladder has caught something. And the bladder itself is attached to the leaf, or to the sort of the stems of the bladderwort, and it has an opening at the far end. And if you're not following my cursor, I'm looking at the little picture in the upper left-hand side. So the little bladder is attached at one end and it's open at the other end, but it has a trap door that can seal shut. So the bladder is like a hollow sack of plant material. So imagine a little almost transparent purse, but it's closed at one end, or it can close at one end, and it's full of water. So the bladder pumps all that water out from inside the bladder to the outside, and it ends up with kind of a squeezed in look, kind of like your lips would look like, or your cheeks would look if you had just been sucking on a lemon. So if an animal comes along, mostly zooplankton, and they wiggle a couple of their little trigger hairs up near that trap door, and if they wiggle those trigger hairs, the trap door is going to be eked open just a tiny bit, and the bladder is going to go and suck that animal right in. And that trap door is going to open and close in a tiny fraction of a second, and voila, the animal is trapped inside. And just like all with those other carnivorous plants, the animal is going to die, this time probably from lack of oxygen, and it's going to start to decompose. And all those yummy nutrients are going to be translocated from that bladder to the rest of the plant. So, and each one of these bladders can fire independently. So you can see that the bladderwort is covered in these bladders. So they can all be firing. They probably aren't firing simultaneously, but they can fire repeatedly, and it takes them probably about 20 minutes to reset themselves and to fire again. So anyway, the other thing about bladderworts is, like the other carnivorous plants, they also have flowers, and the bladderwort flowers are most of the species have bright yellow. A couple of them have purple, but this is the common bladderwort. And I can't remember, it might have been Paul who noticed that the flower looks an awful lot like the head of Scooby-Doo. So that's how we identify bladderworts in the water. If you can only see their flower, you'll know that that's what a bladderwort is. I have another picture of bladderworts. This is a different species. These are horned bladderworts. And these are not growing in the pond. These are actually growing right on the bog mat. And believe it or not, they are growing out of an almost solid mat of sundews. This was a spectacular sight I saw on a bog in Oneida County, not far from where I live. So here's the water's edge. Here is, this is all sundew and also some sphagnum mixed in here. The little bright pink you can see here and there are cranberry flowers. And so these bladderworts are embedded right in the matrix of the sphagnum and the sundew. And the bladders are enmeshed down here in the sphagnum. And I have tried many times. It is very hard to extricate the bladdery parts of this horned bladderwort from the rest of the plant. But you can do it, but it's really tough. But if you ever see a show like this on the edge of a bog, it's almost certainly the horned bladderwort. Get your nose down there because they smell just fabulous. So very, very cool sight to see. These would probably be flowering about mid-July, end of July. And we have orchids. If those bladderworts aren't cool enough, we also have orchids. And this is rose begonia, especially common orchid that you can find in the bog. Usually I would see these about mid-June, so early-ish in the summer. And these are almost always solitary, so you usually see just one of them at a time. Very, very pretty flower. Another beautiful bog orchid is the grass pink, Calopogon tuberosus. These are almost always in multiples, so you'll see a bunch of these. And I think that's about the easiest way. You might notice that the rose begonia has the frilly part of its flower is down, and with the grass pink, that frilly part is up, but I can never remember that. So the way I remember it is that the begonia is solitary or only. So begonia sort of sounds like only. That's how I remember it. And grass pink is the other one. And you can see in this picture, there's a picture of a pitcher plant flower here in the background, and also some lovely bog laurel leaves right here. So a cool flower, a cool plant, a cool site. Another orchid you can sometimes see that I never see are dragon's mouth or Arethusa bulbosa. So I never really see it. Maybe after this we can ask Paul. I'll bet he's seen these and knows where to find them. They're much less common, at least in the bogs around here that I visit. All right, so from the sublime to the grim, let's talk about bog people. So because the peatlands are so anoxic and acidic and cold and waterlogged, and there's so little decomposition, there's not only little decomposition of plant material, there's also very little decomposition of animal material. So from time to time, people have actually found dead bodies in the bog. This is known as Tolland Man, and he was found in Denmark and they believe they dated him to having lived in the 4th century. And so he was naturally preserved in a bog, and his skin was tanned by all the tannins that are in the tannin chemicals that are exuded from the peat. So there was very minimal decomposition. My goodness, you can look, it looks like he's asleep. So much perfect detail remaining in the face of this guy. He had on a little leather cap that didn't even decompose. And again, because there's very little oxygen, it's highly acidic and low temperatures. The acid may have dissolved away his bones. I don't really know. It looks like you can see bones, but I don't know. But usually the acid would dissolve away the phosphate. You can see that this poor guy had a noose around his neck, so who knows what happened to him, but he was either a criminal or had done something naughty. So I don't know, but I've never seen a body. But I will say that once somebody called me and asked me, said that they were a novelist and they wrote books about crime, and they said, would a bog be a good place to leave a body? And I said, well, not really, because the evidence would be there probably forever. And on the other hand, not all that many people venture into the bogs, and not very many people, excavate them. So maybe you could get away with it for a while. And then I thought, oh, and then of course the clever botanist would solve the crime. So I thought that that was maybe a good idea for a novel. So with all this peat everywhere, it can be really fun to see how much peat is actually there. Remember, the peat is the material that is the poorly decomposed or only partially decomposed plant material. And so even when you're standing on a mat of peat, even if you're not on the tippy edge of it, it feels fairly firm, but it is solid peat all the way down until you hit what had been the original lake bed. So how far down that is really depends on what the original shape of that lake was to begin with. So what we do is we take a peat core, and I took these pictures just a few days ago, so I'll take some more pictures of these next summer when I can get something that's a little bit more colorful. But here's the peat core, and it's an implement that's stainless steel, probably about 2.5 feet tall. And it's got this fin that can kind of move back and forth. And what you do is you can see that there's a bolt here at the top, and you fit this handle, which is just a piece of like, I don't know, 1/2-inch pipe with a handle on the top. You fit it onto the top of the core, and you secure it with this bolt. And then you've got a handle and the peat core. And what you do is you drive it into the peat, and you can drive it down pretty easily. It's really not all that hard. And then you give it a twist. And what happens is that fin will stay, and the rest of the peat core will turn, and you'll actually capture a slice out of the peat from way down at the bottom. So this pole is probably about 5 feet tall. So you're capturing a slice of the peat about 5 feet underground. So here are a couple of other pictures. Here you can see, again, the peat core with the handle. And this fellow over here in the bottom left has just jammed that peat core down into the mat. And you can see that he's holding on to the handle. He's going to give it a twist of about 180 degrees. And then these people, it is harder to pull out than it is to put in. And they're hauling up. You can see here's the handle, and they're going to haul it all the way up. Now this one I have been, once you've got the peat core down, you can take off that handle, and you can put another length of pipe on, put the handle back on, drive it in further, and then it's down at the bottom. You can take the handle off again, put another length of pipe on, and you can just keep going like that. I've got about 4 lengths of pipe that you can put on. So when you finally pull it up, you have got a really tall pipe that has been driven down into the peat. And when you pull it up, eventually you can see what the peat looks like down at the very bottom. So this sample here I'm holding probably wasn't taken from the very bottom, because you can see that there's a lot of stuff here that's almost recognizable as plant material. This might even be a fruit from a bog laurel. That's kind of what it looks like. So anyway, this was probably from one of the shallower cores that you can see are from the peat core. So here's the long handle, here's the peat core. And it's a really fun thing to do with especially a group of students. And it's really fun to throw the peat at them when they look like they're not paying attention. So that is kind of fun. Peat is pretty amazing stuff. So peatlands take up about 3% of the land area on Earth. And the peat contains 1/3 of the total carbon that's in the soil all over the Earth. So 3% of the land, but it contains 1/3 of all the carbon that's in the soil all over the world. and it contains 1/6 of the total terrestrial carbon. That's all the carbon that's in trees and corn plants and all the Amazon rainforest, everything. 1/6 of all that carbon is equivalent to all the carbon that's in peat. So obviously, peat is a tremendous sink of carbon. And why do we care about carbon? Because of climate change, and we're worried about an increase in CO2 in our atmosphere. So if all that carbon that's tied up in organic matter were to be released into the atmosphere as CO2, we would double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we all know that would not be good. So the peatlands are an incredibly important carbon sink, and it's very important that with climate change, you can imagine that you're going to get warming, and when you get warming, you're not going to have those peatlands are going to warm up, and there's going to be increased decomposition of all that peat, of all that partially decomposed organic matter. And as it warms, and also as it dries out, there will be more, there'll be less waterlogged soils, and you will also have increased decomposition. And so there's going to be increased CO2 released from all of these peatlands around the world. So that would be a really bad thing. So hopefully we can, and you don't want to drain the peatlands, and you don't want to mess with them. You want to leave them where they are. So in summary, we've got, I told you a few things about bogs. They're very little oxygen because the soils are waterlogged. They're highly acidic. They're cold and sunny because there aren't a whole lot of trees out there. They're extremely low in nutrients. The plants that you're most likely to see, sphagnum leads the way. A lot of relatives of blueberries, different shrubs. You'll see a lot of sedges and some gorgeous orchids, some really cool carnivorous plants. You probably won't see any bog bodies, but they might be under there. And the important thing to remember is that peat is in a very important storage chamber for carbon, and we have to, as much as possible, leave them intact. Okay, that's all I have to say, and I'll see if anybody has any questions.
There were a few questions.
Okay.
Susan, first of all, what time of year does the pitcher plant flower in your
Pretty
area?
early. So, by the end of June, you're seeing the flowers. And you can usually see old flowers, at least the stalk, all year round. So you can see where they were. They'll usually, they'll dry up after the first year, but you can still usually sort of see them. But you can, they'll be flowering from not early summer, but sort of mid-June.
Okay, Mel asked if the pitcher plants eat the larvae that are inside.
No, I don't know how the larvae are not eaten, but I expect really what happens that things have to be decomposed. And so they have to be dead to have whatever bacteria are on the outside of them start that decomposition process. And I imagine that since they are alive, the bacteria that are on the outside, I'm sure they've got bacteria on the outside of the larvae, but the larvae are not dead, and so they're not being decomposed. And maybe they have some other tricks, but they are not, as far as I know, decomposed. They live pretty happily, and it seems like the mosquitoes most deliberately are laying their eggs in the pitchers.
Yeah, I can touch on that one a little bit. I like to talk about this story in the aquatic botany class I teach at Point. The mosquitoes that you showed are Wyomia is the genus of the mosquito that intentionally lays its eggs in the pitcher plant. And in that video that you showed, Susan, there was actually a midge also there, the Metrionemus midge. The pitcher plant midge was actually in the video as well. There was one of those and a whole bunch of mosquitoes, but they live in different sections of the pitcher plant water, and they shred up other insects that fall into the water. There's no enzymes or anything in the water, so the midge and mosquito larvae are not harmed by being in the water, but the other insects that fall in are attacked by these predatory larvae of the midge and mosquito, which shred them up into tiny bits and aid in the decomposition of those bodies so that the pitcher plant can absorb them.
Wow, so that is
Pretty
really
cool
cool.
stuff.
I didn't know that. So the pitch, that's probably a really kind of a symbiosis. So the
Yep.
the insects might not decompose very well if they didn't have the shredders in there. And then probably the larvae are pooping out and nutrients, which is maybe really more what the pitcher plant is taking up.
Right. Exactly. And it's providing a safe place for the insects to live.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Gary also mentioned it was hard to tell an idea of scale with some of those. I think it was a picture of bladderwort flower and the bladders themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Hard time
I'm
without any kind of scale there.
without any scale. Yeah, I took a few pictures out. So the bladders, let's see. So I'm going to swing back up to the bladderwort picture and see if I can. Nope. Okay. So this bladderwort here that I have the picture in the bottom left, that's probably about 6 inches long or so. So the bladders themselves are not microscopic. They're probably about the size, maybe half the size of your little fingernail on your little finger. So they're pretty little, but by no means microscopic. The flower is probably 3/4 of an inch long, pretty conspicuous and very, very showy and really jump out at you. So the picture up in the top left of the close-up of the bladder, so that little bladder is probably maybe 2 to 3 millimeters long, maybe 1/4 of an inch.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. It's 4:01, I see. So Sue asked, aside from the carnivorous plants, where do the other plants and trees in the bog find their nutrients?
Wow, that's a good question. They must just deal with low nutrients. I've never really thought about that, but that is a good question. I don't know, but they somehow manage. I don't know, Paul, do you have any thoughts on that?
And my understanding is that a lot of the plants, like the Andromeda that you mentioned before, the rosemary, they have really bitter compounds in their evergreen leaves so that they don't get grazed on. And that way they don't have to produce as many leaves and new tissues every year. But they're also very long-lived and they grow a very small amount per year. So they hang on, but they certainly aren't very productive. They just grow at a very slow rate and try to hang on to as much of the plant material as possible so they don't have to replace it the following year.
Yep. All of that I think is true, which kind of makes sense except for the larch or the tamarack. So
Yeah.
So there's obviously more than one way to skin a cat. I don't really know, but it does make sense that almost all of those plants do have evergreen leaves, and so they are not replaced very often.
All right, I think we're going to call it there. It's 4:03. Thank you so much, Susan, for being here. There is one more thing I wanted to mention before we call it here is just the January webinar on groundwater and lakes. So catch that next month. I'll send out a reminder a couple days in advance like I did for this one. And remember, you'll have to register for that one individually. Each webinar has to be registered for individually in order to get the link to join. So with that, everyone have a very happy holiday season, and we'll hopefully catch you at the end of January.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for everybody for coming, and have happy holidays. Bye-bye.